almost 5,000 years ago. In the fertile soils of the Middle East, pagan religions prevailed in Mesopotamia. These pagans generated a number of myths and superstitions about the origin of life and the universe. One of these was the belief in evolution. According to the Sumerian Enuma Elish epic, life first appeared spontaneously in water, then evolving one species from another. Many years later, the myth of evolution found fertile ground in another pagan civilization, ancient Greece. Some Greek philosophers, calling themselves materialists, accepted only the existence of matter and counted matter as the original source of life. Consequently, they resorted to the myth of evolution, inherited from the Sumerians, to explain how living beings came into existence. Thus, ancient Greece became the junction point of materialist philosophy and the myth of evolution. The pagan Romans later cherished this heritage. These two concepts from idol-worshipping cultures were introduced to the modern world in the 18th century. Some European intellectuals, influenced by ancient Greek sources, who accordingly adopted materialism with one common belief. They were completely against the very idea of monotheistic religion. The book by the renowned materialist Baron de Holbach, The System of Nature, was considered the principal source of atheism. In this context, the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was the first person to give a detailed account of the theory of evolution. Lamarck's theory, which was later refuted, maintained that living beings evolved from one another through slight variations over time. It was Charles Darwin who repeated and popularized Lamarck's views, albeit in a slightly different form. Darwin revealed his views in England in 1859 through the publication of his book The Origin of the Species. Darwin's book was in reality a detailed version of the evolution myth, originally introduced by the ancient Sumerians. His theory maintained that all the different species came from a common ancestor that appeared in water by chance, which every living species had sprung from over time, again by chance. This assertion of Darwin was not based on clear scientific grounds, and hence was not extensively adopted by the scientists of his time. Paleontologists in particular were aware that the entire theory was largely a figment of his imagination. The fossil record revealed that living things did not undergo an evolutionary process from primitive to the complex. Even the living things which lived hundreds of millions of years ago possessed the same complex structures of their counterparts living today. There was no trace of transitional forms that Darwin assumed to have existed and which were supposed to link one species to another. In the years to come, other assertions of the theory were refuted one after another. Biochemistry revealed that life was too complex to have emerged by chance as Darwin claimed. It was realized that even the random formation of the simplest protein molecule was impossible, let alone a living cell itself. Anatomy, on the other hand, showed that living beings had distinct designs and were created separately. In brief, Darwin's theory lacked a scientific basis. However, the theory was quick to gain political support, since it did provide the so-called scientific basis for the dominant powers of the 19th century. In 1871, Darwin published another book, The Descent of Man, in which he claimed that man evolved from some ape-like creatures. Darwin was unable to provide any evidence supporting his claims, but clearly fabricated some imaginary scenarios. Darwin also embraced an interesting thought. He asserted that some races were more evolved and therefore more advanced than others, whilst other races, on the other hand, he considered still to be at the same level as the apes. There was another important aspect to Darwin's theory. He erected his entire theory on the concept of struggle for survival. According to him, a fierce conflict, a bloody struggle pervaded the natural world. The strong always won against the weak and thus ensured development. Darwin asserted that a similar conflict also held true for human races. Even the subtitle in his book, The Origin of the Species by Way of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, explicitly reveals his racial views. According to Darwin, the favored race was the European white man. Asian or African races were, quite simply, failing in the struggle for survival. Darwin went one step further and even suggested that these races would finally be totally annihilated. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. As this statement explicitly reveals, Darwin was an out-and-out racist, believing in the superiority of the white man. He believed the white man would, in time, first enslave and then eradicate the so-called inferior races. Indeed, Darwin's ideas found fertile ground. In his time, the white man was already in search of a theory to justify his crimes. From the 16th century on,